I'm tired. My fucking back hurts. But most of all, I'm fucking broken. Hello there, men, and welcome to the Masculinism Movement channel, a place for men to be men and talk about masculinity and men's issues. I'm your host, Brian Crawl, and today I'm going to be mansplaining to you about the broken man. I'm broken. People say that there's a masculinity crisis, but what does this mean exactly? Seems like a rather abstract statement. And what if, more specifically, the problem is that there are simply too many broken men out there? I think this is actually the case. For you see, I myself am a broken fucking man. And because I am one, I'm able to recognize this problem firsthand. What it looks like to me is that we live in a society that breaks men as it does horses or other wild animals in order to domesticate them. But what happens when you push a wild animal too far in doing so? What happens when you put an animal into a cage and prod it with a stick? Or you continually beat it to make it perform for you? In spite of being beaten and broken and imprisoned, the animal will still eventually attack those who have broken it. This should come as no surprise to you, as it shouldn't to a park ranger in Kenya named Alexander Rono when he was attacked by a leopard. He was attempting to relocate the leopard. He had captured it in a cage and drove it to a new site, but when the cage was opened, the leopard didn't want to just get out. Not yet. It was probably feeling overwhelmed with emotions from being captured and was tired and grumpy from them. Or maybe a tranquilizer dart. I don't know if that's how they caught it. So the ranger started poking at it with a stick to try to get it to come out. He had been working with animals for 22 years and never been attacked before, so he wasn't worried. And he was doing this from inside his truck, which the cage was in the bed of, just behind his passenger seat. So he could poke at the leopard while still sitting in the driver's seat, leaning out the window. Eventually the poking worked. It made the leopard want to get out of the cage so that it could fucking attack him, which it did. Very quickly. It ran out of the cage, around the side of the vehicle, and jumped into the window before the ranger had a chance to shut it, and began scratching at his fucking face, which it again did quite quickly. Alexander Rono had to get 21 stitches and says it was a valuable lesson. Does that sound like a lot to you? Let's circle back to that later. This story made me recall another news story I saw back in 1994 as a kid. A 21-year-old circus elephant named Tyke got so fed up of being beaten into submission and forced to do things it didn't want to, like put on these crazy performances for mere peanuts, and it started to go crazy. It killed its own trainer, the one who had trained it to be tame and compliant, and then it ran off. Being met with the big, scary world outside in the big city of Honolulu, it became spooked and started going even more crazy. It went on a literal wild rampage through town and had to be shot to death by multiple police officers using 86 rounds of ammunition. I will always remember the look in its eyes as it was being shot to death. It was one of fear and panic, something that really spoke to me as a young child who was similarly imprisoned and abused by my fucking awful psychopathic parents, and also the school that was much like a prison that I was confined to and abused at also. That look of fear and panic told me that this poor creature was just trying to get to safety, something it obviously didn't feel back at the circus with its trainer, who is reported to have abused it. And you'd think it would only be logical the elephants stopped being used for circuses after that, but nope, they didn't. We all know that. For these casualties were only a small sacrifice to make for us people to have circuses. For there is this old saying, panem et circenses, or bread and circuses. Give them bread and circuses, a political mantra used by the powers that be to mean that all it takes to appease and placate the masses is just bread and circuses. They think that if they give us men enough to eat and entertain us, that we will have no reason to revolt against our oppression and enslavement. The arrogance of the powers that be. Arrogance that causes them to do such things as to capture the largest, most dangerous apex predators in the world and enslave them too. and make them dance around for our entertainment. These are the kinds of things that happen when people are so arrogant as to think of themselves as being on top of the dominance hierarchy, that they can and should capture and attempt to control and use the apex predators on Earth, even if just for their own enjoyment. Which really sounds crazy when you put it plainly like that, doesn't it? For we're talking about animals that are so dangerous, we really have no logical business trying to interact with them at all, let alone for such trivial pursuits as to make them part of a circus. And yet, people do it because we people are an apex predator as well. Mankind is also part of the animal kingdom, and I don't have to tell you that we are at the top of the food chain. So, since we are apex predators, that explains why men are sometimes so arrogant as to think they ought to try to do such things to other apex predators. Such is the competition for dominance in the animal kingdom. That competition is natural. However, animals breaking, subjugating, and enslaving other animals, manipulating them, controlling them, abusing them not only physically, but psychologically, emotionally, this is not a part of nature and is a purely human form of dominance that only came about as part of society and so-called civilized living. This is where dominance goes from domination to what is technically, by definition, called domineering. It is what people who have superiority complexes or who crave power and control tend to do to others. People have long done things such as breaking horses, where a horse's wild spirit is, quote, broken, so that it can be tamed and used for work or riding or whatever. A horse that has not been broken will not make a good workhorse. It will not want to be ridden because that hurts its spine. Nor will it want to do the back-breaking labor you don't want to do because it would break your back to do so, because it is also back-breaking for the horse. The only way a horse will submit to such enslavement and physical abuse is if it has been broken. Once a being's independent spirit has been broken, they can be dominated and used and made to suffer abuses as punishment for not doing what their superior wants. And this is the same thing that women in society and the powers that be do to the general population of us men, the workhorses of civilization. They break us so that we can be tamed and domesticated, or in other words, enslaved and exploited for their purposes. Whether at work or at home, a man is treated like a broken animal without a spirit. Not something to be valued and respected, something to be used and abused. Civilization was built on and subsists upon the backs of these men, or slaves. And just how do they break us? With dark and harmful psychological manipulation tactics, such as breaking down your sense of identity, your self-esteem, brainwashing, guilt-tripping, shaming, humiliation, and other methods of basically psychologically harming or even torturing the person enough so that they no longer possess the mental strength for things such as confidence, individuality, independence, agency, speaking up for themselves, that. They no longer possess the mental wherewithal to stand up for themselves. They will no longer try to defend their dignity and demand respect from others, because they have no sense of dignity left and have no self-esteem, so they don't expect to be respected by others and don't take offense to it when someone disrespects them. They've basically had their identity and agency taken away from them and have no ability to defend themselves anymore. You could tell exactly who these men are because they act exactly as a slave does, like docile, domesticated livestock. But while women and society in general may have been successful in controlling men for the most part, the problem is that we are just like those other apex predators who cannot be totally controlled and subjugated. Just because a man has been broken and subjugated doesn't mean you have complete and total control over him. He may seem like he is under your control for some time, but it will not last forever, not with every man. There will always be men who will find the strength to rebel. For you see, unlike women, most men believe in fixing things that are broken. And so, broken men, such as myself, will often fix themselves and build themselves back up in strength, often even stronger than they were before. Or, at the very least, they will pretend to, through overcompensation and narcissism, becoming arrogant, and doing things such as puffing up their chest all the time, like a bird trying to make itself look bigger so it doesn't get attacked by other large birds, and getting defensive towards those who seem to notice that he is not really as big as he's trying to make others think, and that underneath that puffed up chest he holds vulnerability and open wounds. And if anyone touches one of his wounds, or even seems like they're going to, he will become volatile and even violent. And in fact, people know this about others, just like they know of animals' propensity towards violence and attacks, but for some reason, they still continue to try to break, tame, domesticate, and enslave us men, even going so far as to prodding us when we are wounded and prone to lashing out. And then they act so shocked and surprised when it doesn't work out in their favor, and we do act out like the abused animals we're being treated as. Just like the park ranger who got attacked by a leopard because he had caged it and was prodding it with a stick. And shockingly, that leopard saw him as an attacking enemy, and so the cat attacked back, causing him to need 21 stitches. Many of you are probably out there thinking about how horrific this is and what a bad leopard that was to have victimized this man, but I identify with the leopard in this story, as I'm sure other men do out there too. For I've been held captive, I've been locked up, I've been physically and mentally abused all throughout my life. And those 21 stitches are actually not as bad as they may seem. I know it may seem like a lot, but it's not really, and it could have been much worse. For instance, one time I nearly took a big dude's eye out for threatening me and coming at me, and he needed 23 stitches in his face. Or at least that's what he told me later, assuming he wasn't exaggerating just to make me feel bad, which I did. And I'm not even a leopard. I was just a guy who was holding a glass cup and used it as a weapon because I was scared and needed to defend myself. And I guarantee you that that leopard can easily do exponentially more damage than I can, and might have actually been holding back because it didn't feel that threatened and had no intent to kill the man, just to defend itself, or maybe to vent a little of its rage. But in my situation, I actually did feel threatened by this big guy coming at me. I too know what it feels like to be physically abused or attacked. And even though my spirit and mind have been broken, I too can still defend myself. And in that situation, I felt my body acting on its own to defend itself without me even being a conscious participant and thinking about what I was doing. It wasn't a rational or intellectual decision to attack this man. It was purely an instinctive defense mechanism. And I know all of you are probably out there right now ignoring my claim that it was involuntary and judging me, saying, "Oh, I'd never do something like that. How could you do such a thing? You animal. You should always use words, not violence." But I maintain my assertion that it was involuntary. And let me add that I had tried to use words before using violence, and I had also recently suffered my own attack when the business I was managing at the time was robbed, and I was attacked from behind and bludgeoned over the head for minutes on end by the burglar while he was screaming at me to give him the key to the safe. And since he had started by attacking rather than asking and communicating with words, I was already barely conscious when he first asked for the key. So I was unable to respond, and he just kept beating me over the head and yelling at me to give it to him until he split my fucking head open, and I totally lost consciousness. This was one of the 2 worst beatings I've ever taken in my life, and I've taken many, and a lot of bad ones too. This was the only one that anyone actually took me to the hospital for, wherein I got my head stapled shut and was diagnosed as having suffered a traumatic brain injury and having PTSD. Now, this was only just one of countless beatings I've taken in my life, as I've lived in ghettos and been part of gang culture too when I was younger. So I've learned firsthand what happens to a man who gets beaten enough. Eventually your brain gets so traumatized and damaged that it starts to go psychotic at even the hint of a threat of danger, and you will begin acting like a caged animal, biting at anyone who seems like they're about to prod you with a stick. And so that man who threatened me and got hospitalized for it and needed major eye surgery to remove the 23 pieces of glass from around it, well, he actually knew me, and he knew what had happened to me. And he knew that he should have known better than to threaten me like that. Which is why, instead of pressing charges, he simply told me how many stitches I caused him to need and tried to make me feel remorseful, which I was. There was a distinct possibility that I may have very well been charged with aggravated assault and put into a cage with other violent animals such as myself, causing the vicious cycle of violence to continue to be perpetuated more and more. For once society has broken a man too much to the point where he is so traumatized that he can't even regulate his own emotions or control his physical defense mechanisms, that is the only place left for him to go. Prison. And society will point their fingers at him and say, you are bad, this is your fault, when they imprison him. But whose fault is it really? People do not choose to be subjected to that kind of violence, and the manner in which it completely rewires and reprograms your brain to not be able to cope with threats. This reminds me of a prison gang movie I saw once called Shot Caller, about a man who accidentally kills someone with his car and gets sent to jail, where he's subjected to the violent gang culture and is forced to adapt and join a gang, or be beaten and raped constantly for the many years of his sentence for manslaughter. Now, that's obviously a horrible culture to be in, but keep in mind, jail isn't the only place men are faced with such things. One day, he and some of his fellow inmates are in their respective cages, and the gang boss, who is basically coaching them, says to him, they put us in these cages to try to break us. But I would contend that men who go to jail for violent crimes were already broken before they even became violent in the first place. That it was being broken that made them violent criminals. And besides, prison isn't meant to break men. It's meant to either fix them or enslave them and milk them out of whatever physical labor they're still good for. All prisons are also slave labor camps, you see. It is just one microcosm that exists in the macrocosm of a civilization that subsists based upon the male slavery that provide subsidies for the rich and powerful who govern us. And that brings me to the real problem that causes men to become broken in the first place, which is their enslavement to society. And as we have seen, abolishing slavery doesn't really abolish it. Just because men are not being beaten into submitting to forced labor on slave-run plantations doesn't mean that men are not still being enslaved and beaten into submission. The means of enslaving them are more mental than physical now, employing methods I previously listed. And psychological manipulation is only being used now because it is actually even more effective than physical torture, as everyone now knows, especially sadists. This information is not new, nor is the fact that things such as shaming and humiliation get wired into the brain the same as physical abuse. That is, as trauma. Because these things are forms of psychological trauma. And it shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, unless you are living in a bubble atop an ivory tower and have never had to suffer anything close to trauma. Or you are a sociopath who cannot empathize with or understand or even recognize the feelings of others. Or you are a fucking retard and your brain doesn't work right. And if you need proof, just Google it. It's all over the academic literature. Don't be fucking ignorant. And it should also come as no surprise that people who have been through these kinds of psychological traumas, or any traumas of any kind, will simply be emotionally weaker than those who haven't. There's a mantra that gets repeated by macho retards that whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And while it takes a seriously macho retard to believe such a thing, or maybe just someone who has never actually been through anything that hard before, that is actually, taken away from them in ways that could never be repaired, these are the kinds of bad attitudes we men have to deal with. Attitudes that are instilled in us through our cultural conditioning and social programming that tell us to tolerate abuses and try to bear it without showing any emotion, because that's what a strong man is supposed to do. But unless you're a sociopath, which some men become in order to endure such abuses, you are going to be made emotionally weaker by having to endure too much psychological abuse. Even if it seems like you are making yourself stronger, what is actually happening is narcissism. A man will suppress his feelings and try to steel himself and be strong and macho and not let it bother him, but instead, it just goes into his subconscious mind, where these things build up over time as they are repressed. And what this man does to compensate for all the blows to his self-esteem is he talks himself up in his mind and becomes narcissistic from his inferiority complex, turning it into a superiority complex. He will try to make himself confident, but instead, all he does is make himself arrogant and narcissistic. He will also become more prone to repeating this cycle of abuse with others too. For what happens is that narcissistic people like this are easily triggered by any perceived slights to their self-esteem, which they think is high, but is actually quite low. And even if they are not technically a narcissist with narcissistic personality disorder, people with damaged self-esteem are more prone to hostility and lashing out. And it all stems from the fact that this person has been broken by society and is suffering from a guilt and shame complex. So they perceive any kind of attack as a serious threat, which triggers defense mechanisms that they are not in control of. One recent study proved this, finding that feelings of shame are in fact associated with low self-esteem and hostility. Velati et al., 2017. And it should come as no surprise to anyone with any level of social intelligence that if you are constantly putting someone into a state of duress, they are bound to become unstable. And yet society does this to men constantly, and to such a degree that they actually begin to suffer from a number of psychological disorders from it. And then when they become reactive and start to fight back, what do people do? They blame and shame and try to break the man down even more. And if the man claims that you pushed him to it and he couldn't control himself anymore, he is told, be a real man and take responsibility. Control yourself. And they will just keep at it until you are fully broken and submit to them and go back to the plantation. I always ask people to stop multiple times before I finally get to the point of doing something such as using strong language or a raised voice or a more physical assertion of boundaries or defensiveness or violence. And they always act so shocked and appalled, even though they were the ones who kept disrespecting me and pushing me more and more as I was asking them politely and repeatedly, redundantly even, to stop and respect my boundaries. And so of course things escalated. And then when they react with shock and horror, I'll always say, well, why didn't you just stop when I asked you to nicely? And they will just always revert right back to the same exact thing, telling me that it's because a real man shouldn't be bothered by anything and should just take it, or some arbitrary bullshit like that, along with another insult such as how I'm crazy and overly sensitive, or something else to continue to invalidate my feelings and shame me for having them, and moreover break my will and subjugate me to theirs. Like I'm supposed to just go, oh, please tell me more about how I should, quote, be a real man for you. This is exactly why some wounded and broken men such as myself stop using words to defend themselves and start using action, such as physical violence. It's only a logical next step at a certain point, and the brain knows when it has reached that last resort. This isn't the first reaction, of course. When a broken man is being mistreated and first becomes reactive, it's not like his first initial reaction is to get violent. Just like I said, violence comes when the man's words are not enough. When he draws boundaries and asserts his agency and his wish to be respected and tries to defend his honor the civil way and continues to be pushed. The people laugh at his demand for respect. Ha! Respect a slave? That's a laugh. Why are you being so sensitive? Don't you know you are supposed to be strong and not care what anyone says or does to you? His attempts to verbally defend himself using the polite and civil language taught to him by his therapist to help him to avoid getting into fights simply never works. People won't respect a man just because he asks for it. They use it as an opportunity to disrespect him further. Any sign of emotion or vulnerability is perceived by them as a prompt to attack and keep trying to break him down until he has nothing left to fight for. Eventually, his traumatized brain knows the only way to be able to stand your ground is to physically push back. And these abusive people will then act shocked that when they poked and prodded a caged, wounded animal, that after being poked enough in the same raw, wounded area, it finally lashes out and attacks them. But why should that be such a surprise? Either these abusers are real social retards, or them acting surprised anytime you react badly to their mistreatment is just part of their manipulation and means of controlling you. Or it could be a mix of both, since a person can be stupid and manipulative at the same time, as we have seen with many, if not most, women out there. And it would certainly take a high level of stupidity or even mental retardation for a physically inferior, small and weak woman to be abusive towards and provoke a man who may be broken but is still one of the world's apex predators, who can be dangerous if pushed to it. And then to continue pushing him to no end? It just doesn't make sense. It seems like a very stupid and potentially socially retarded thing to do. But people do it all the time. The world is full of domineering people, especially women, who treat men without any fear or respect and constantly mistreat them, only doubling down on their efforts when he protests. It is as if they wish to push him past his limits, because perhaps that is what it takes to break a man. I don't know why they do it, honestly. I'm not a female. But I do know that if you keep pushing a broken man far enough, he will eventually push back. And fight back if you keep pushing after that. And I know that rebellions, revolutions, and entire wars have been waged by these kinds of men. Men who are broken. Men who are slaves. The history books are littered with these stories, such as those of the 3 great servile wars of ancient Rome, which you probably know the name Spartacus from the 3rd one of. These rebellions and revolutions are how slaves rise up and gain equal rights and freedoms, to not be bound and beaten and worked to death. It's only natural for a slave class to revolt against those above them, for they have nothing to lose and everything to gain. and will eventually get to the point where they can't stand their position in society and the way they're treated anymore. And they finally get upset enough to stand up and do something about it. They were made to live on the bottom of a social hierarchy and get shit on by everyone else above them. But people cannot take that kind of treatment forever. And in nature, among the animal kingdom that we are a part of, competition is only natural when you are fighting for survival. And when you make people feel like they are living at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at bare subsistence and survival level, and that they will need to fight to get more for themselves, well, that is exactly what they're bound to do. And men are now rising up again, for we have been again allowing ourselves to be bound and beaten too hard for too long. So don't be stupid and act all surprised as we begin to fight back and demand respect for ourselves. Don't be shocked when we realize that you don't have our best interests in mind and have never been on our side, and we now know who our enemies are, and it's you. When we realize that you aren't our wives, girlfriends, family, friends, employers, and authorities. You are our slave drivers. Don't be surprised when if you don't willingly respect us when we use our polite, passive, peaceful words. We force you to respect us with violent ones and actions too. And don't be surprised when we begin to take action, because it's about damn time, if you ask me. And only a fucking retard would be stupid enough to beat a wild animal until it's good and broken, and then keep prodding it at its wounds as it whimpers in pain as a sign of submission and a plea for your sympathy to recognize its pain. It's only natural for something that you are causing pain, in spite of it already being defeated and surrendering, to then defend itself by any means necessary, and even fight to the death. Everyone knows that's what animals do when backed into a corner facing death, because at that point they have nothing to lose. And neither do most men anymore either. Society has taken everything from us and continues to beat us and try to get more. It would take an actual fucking retard to keep prodding a wounded animal as if it won't bite you. And yet people with power in society, like women, do it to us men all the time. And stupider yet, they act surprised when they do get bitten back. Well, let me tell you something. Someone who's that stupid and probably downright retarded doesn't deserve to have power over me or any adult man out there either. So stand up for yourselves, men, and know that there are others like you, such as myself, who are here to do this together with you. It's time for us broken, beaten, wounded warriors to begin to revolt against the system of oppression, abuse, and enslavement that we live in. It's time for us to rise up and fight for our honor and defend ourselves like the beasts that we are. We need to show the world that we will not allow ourselves to be beaten down, abused, used, or coerced in any way, physical or mental. It's time we demand respect for our goddamn masculinity, whether we have to get it the nice way or by any other means necessary. Because the reality is that we are the ones who have the physical and mental power to take control of anything we want to. In fact, we have so much power that we just give it away freely. We have a surplus of it and we hand it out as though we have too much of it to even contain, so that we have allowed other people to become our masters and just take from us freely. And it is time for us to take our power back, men. So if someone pushes you, resist and fight back. You have more power than you may even realize. And if we broken men actually begin to unite, we can easily outnumber and overpower any other group or organization. Just as the slaves learned in the Servile Wars, when the world is mostly made up of the slave class, is them having broken our will to even try to speak of rebellion. Because all it would take is for us to take action all together at once as one. And that is why I am trying to bring us broken, battered, bruised, and betrayed men together here into a movement. A unified front of resistance against women and the powers that be of the evil fucking matriarchy. Because that is all we need to do to be heard and recognized and stop being treated like fucking livestock. So, who is with me? Let me know in the comments below. And for those of you who are against us, you are actually the one who is going to have to learn to control yourself. Learn to watch your fucking mouth, or you might catch a fucking foot in it. Because some of us men are ready to fight, and we know how to as well. Because while you've been living in your fucking bubble atop your little ivory tower, we have been readying ourselves for a fight. And if you are going to go around provoking people, that is just logically what you can expect in return. And you will learn to fear a broken man, to fear breaking a man, to fear even allowing your fellow man to be broken by anyone else. People will learn to be peaceful, or else, because the only other option is violence. And those who cannot treat others with basic human rights and respect, who act like they do not want peace, deserve war. And if you are speaking warring words or declaring war, you can simply expect those you have made enemies out of to prepare to fight you. I myself was once a peaceful pacifist hippie, if you can believe it, but I was punished for my peaceful pacifist vulnerability and turned into a wounded warrior who is now ready to defend himself with violence. It wasn't the path I chose. It wasn't my decision. It was simply my fate, because that is how the world is. That is how people treat men like me. And so this is who I am now. It's how I am now. Anyone who fucks with me is putting themselves in danger. My brain is wired with so much trauma that I don't even have a conscious choice over my actions at a certain point. If someone threatens me or torments me enough, at some point, I lose control and physically defend myself. And that person learns a lesson that they'll never forget. The same kind of lessons that I learned so many times myself. Lessons that get wired into your brain and your body. And the lesson is, don't be arrogant and underestimate others and go talking shit to someone who may actually be more powerful than you. Both of the stories I started with happened after 2 decades passed for those professionals without such incidents. You may think you have someone subjugated and that you could do whatever you want to them, but that can be a very fatal error to make. Never underestimate the power of a broken man to fix himself and rise up against you. And if any of you men out there feel broken like me and need someone to help bring you up, just let me know. This community will never work if we don't communicate and reach out to each other to help one another and support the broken men of society who need it. That concludes this video. Thanks for listening. I hope I mansplained that good enough for you. If you liked that, please click the like button. And if you feel you gained some value from this video and would like to give some back, please do so with the PayPal link below, because your support helps fund me doing this work and fight the good fight for men like you. And if you are ready to take the red pill and wake up from the matrix and the matriarchy controlling it and learn everything you need to know about female on male sexism, get your copy of my newly released book, Misandry Exposed, today. On sale for a special sale price that won't last long. So check it out by clicking the link below. And otherwise, you can stay tuned for the next video coming out tomorrow, which will be on how to cope with being an incel. And until then, take care of yourselves, men, because no woman out there is going to.